and thanks for inviting me to your respectable establishment. I'll open with perhaps 20-25 minutes of an overview of the way I see the developments in the region. As said, I'm a journalist, so I represent my own opinion here. I don't represent the Israeli government in any chance, although the Israeli ambassador is sitting next to me. I don't think he's watching me. We are just concluding, I think, the most quiet 2 years and most calm 2 years that we had in Israel since the state was established. The last 2 years have been very unusually calm, both along the borders of Israel and in terms of terror attacks. But despite that, I think that we are seeing underneath the surface some serious changes and dramatic changes that I think are right now occupying most people in the region, not just Israel. The first of those changes, I think, and something worth paying notice to, is the fact that the regional agenda today, for the first time in 80 or 90 years, is being set by non-Arab countries. The traditional balance power of the region is changing. And today we see Iran and Turkey taking the lead in setting the region's agenda, and the traditional Arab powers, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, have weakened. Also because of the weakening of the U.S. position. The U.S. position in the region is on the decline in the last 2 years. And the most troubling part of that change, I think, is Iran being a part of what we call the radical axis. As we see today, this axis used to consist of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas in Gaza might win another victory in Iraq. There's a big question mark on the future of Iraq, but it appears that Iran will have a lot of influence on any Iraqi government that we'll see. So the threat in the eyes of Israel, and I think of most of the Sunni countries, of a Shiite arch stretching from the Persian Gulf, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah on the Mediterranean, and Hamas on the Mediterranean, is beginning to realize. And I think for most people in the region, and even if you speak to people outside Israel, they would tell you that that development is overshadowing everything else because it is backed by the Iranian ambitions for nuclear power. Now, I think that Iran doesn't conceal its desire to regain, for the first time in centuries, I think, its position as leader of the Muslim world, to take the Shiite, which was traditionally considered the inferior sect by most of the Sunnis, and again lead the Muslim world. And by the way, I think that at some point we'll see a competition between Turkey and Iran on that role. But the position of the Arab world is weakening. And I think that the whole of the region is watching Iran's nuclear program with a lot of concern. Unlike the case of Iraq, it's not a question of intelligence. I mean, the data is out there. IIEA is printing the numbers every 3 months in its report. Iranians are well on the way for obtaining nuclear capability. Several years ago, I think that most intelligence services in the world identified that right now they are not pursuing a nuclear bomb. They're pursuing breakout capability. They want to amass enough fissile material in order to be 6 months away from, to allow them to withdraw from the NPT and then obtain nuclear weapons. But they don't pursue the weapons per se. And they believe, I think, that with nuclear capabilities, they will have a chance to regain that position. And you could see other countries in the region beginning to prepare for that day, because I think that the common understanding in the Middle East is that there's no determined international coalition willing to stop Iran. And you see the Jordanians sign an agreement to buy a peaceful nuclear reactor in recent months. And you see, according to the IIEA, the Egyptians playing with all kinds of experiments in their own Inshas reactor, which they don't report to the IIEA, so they also consider their options. And there's always been rumors about the Saudi-Pakistani agreement that Pakistan will provide nuclear warheads to Saudi Arabia once there will be a Shiite nuclear bomb. Everybody's preparing for that moment. And the fear is that a nuclear Iran is going to change the face of the region. One thing is assured, it will start an arms race between most of the countries in the region. I cannot imagine the Sunni world watching the Shiites become nuclear and staying behind. And the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, I think, is going to be very destabilizing. I think it's something that should trouble the whole of the international community. Now, in many European capitals that I visit, I get the sense that there is some kind of expectation that Israel will put its hand in the oven, strike the Iranian nuclear program, pay the price for it, because there is a price for it, and solve the problem for the world. Looking at the Iranian nuclear program, looking at the way it was dispersed, and looking at the way that the Iranians have learned the lessons from Israel's 1981 attack on the Iraqi reactor in Baghdad, or even the 2007 attack on the Syrian reactor, the Iranians have made their nuclear program very dispersed, very hardened. Most of it is underground, sometimes under mountains with lots of layers of concrete. And if you take that, you take the range from Israel to Iran, 1,500 kilometers in direct line, and you look at the assets of the Israeli military, of the Israeli Air Force, you realize that Israel's military options are not very bright. That is not to say that Israel is not preparing a military option against Iran. But I think the dilemma, and I hope we won't reach that day, but the dilemma placed before an Israeli prime minister whether to accept a nuclear Iran or to order a strike which would immediately trigger a response from Lebanon, and Lebanon, we'll touch it a bit later, but Lebanon has the capability to make life in Israel very hard. It's a very tough dilemma. No Israeli prime minister will be happy to go along with it, and having said that the Iranian nuclear program is not meant right now to obtain a nuclear weapon would allow, I think, both Israel and parts of the West to keep pushing the red line forward and keep compromising and wait a little longer until it might be too late. Because if you noticed in all the negotiations that the Iranians had, they made a point that any compromise will still allow them to keep a pile high enough of enriched uranium inside Iran that is sufficient for a single bomb. So they would never give away enough enriched uranium that would not allow them to jump into a bomb. They make this point very clearly in all of their negotiations. So this, I think, is troubling right now most of the region. And you saw yesterday the visit of President Ahmadinejad to Lebanon. I think the good definition would be a victory tour. It looks like Iran is about to successfully export for the first time its revolution to another country. And what the Iranians have created in Lebanon is a monster. We have an army within a state, and looking at the firepower that this army possesses, I'm not sure there are many countries in the world today that possess the firepower that Hezbollah has. Hezbollah has deployed today 40,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon. That's a huge, massive power. I imagine that most European countries don't possess those kind of capabilities. And he exists within the Lebanese state, waiting for that day, waiting for the day that Israel would strike Iran. We saw in the 2006 war in Lebanon that the Iranians were extremely furious that the Hezbollah gun fired ahead of plan. They have created this capability for a specific time in history and a specific intention. This was supposed to be Iran's front position against Israel if anybody would strike Iran. And Hezbollah admitted that he didn't intended to trigger a war in July 2006. And Iran made a point of not allowing Hezbollah during those 33 days of conflict not to use the Iranian weapons. Most of the 4,000 rockets that we absorbed in Israel during the conflict were Syrian-made. The Iranian Zalzal heavy rockets provided from Iran were not put into play because Iran made a point of it. And after the war, they made their monitoring on Hezbollah even tighter. They have sent Revolutionary Guards officers that now accompany the military chiefs of Hezbollah to make sure that Hezbollah will not go into conflict with Israel ahead of planned. And Hezbollah was placed with some serious challenges at the time. In 2008, Israel assassinated Hezbollah's military mastermind in Damascus, Imad Mounia, really the brilliant mind behind most of Hezbollah operations, a very painful blow to Hezbollah. They vowed to avenge, but they didn't dare to fire a single shot along the border for 4 years because Iran made it clear that they should not go to war with Israel unless it's that doomsday that someone will attack Israel. Now, internally in Lebanon, I'm not sure that Hezbollah is ready to really take over the country. I think that they are still waiting. I think that they're still not prepared to turn Lebanon into a Shiite country. But if you look at Lebanese demographics, they're well on the way. They can count on demographics that in several years, Shiites, which is the largest minority in Lebanon today, will become a small majority. And then there will be more than just members of the coalition, I guess. I think they would lead the country. And the Lebanese are watching this, and for some reason, watching Hariri visiting Damascus, people in Lebanon say that every time he visits Assad, he tells him that you remind me of my father. But you see that of the March 14 camp, of the Christians and Sunni camp in Lebanon, there's not much left. Hezbollah is the strong power in Lebanon today. Moving into the Palestinian issue, which I know is very interesting for the Europeans, but right now, I think most of the region, including the Palestinians and the Israelis, have very little expectations from the ongoing negotiations. In fact, of all the parties involved, it appears that the American president is the only person that has any expectations that something will come out of the current negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians, because I think that the Palestinians sense first that they can achieve much more, gain much more without engaging Israel in negotiations. And second, when they look at Israel, they see a leadership right now which is not ready or not willing or incapable of making the concessions required to reach a final status agreement. And on the other side, the Israelis, when they look at the Palestinian leadership, they also see a leadership which will not sign end of conflict, a leadership which might reach an interim agreement with us, but not an end of conflict. Now, Palestinian Authority people would tell you in private, and I'm not sure they would say it in public, that the separation between the West Bank and Gaza is one of the good things that happened to them. The burden of representing Gaza as well they've been relieved of it. Because if you know Gaza and the West Bank, these are two very, very different populations. Israel, as punishment in the past, used to exile people from Gaza to the West Bank, because if you were a Gazan in the West Bank, nobody would speak with you, because they are considered a very different population by the Palestinians. And you look at the West Bank. West Bank is a productive society with a solid middle class, educated, people that have a future. Combine that with the really remarkable work that the Palestinian Prime Minister is doing on the ground, Salam Fayyad. For the first time in the history of the Palestinian National Movement, we see a genuine effort to create infrastructure for the future Palestinian state. There are effective security forces, well-trained, not corrupt as their predecessors, confident. They are confronting Hamas all levels of the West Bank, both operating against Hamas military capabilities, but also outrooting Hamas civilian infrastructure. All those civilian institutions that were providing services to the Palestinian population in the West Bank are systematically being outrooted by the Palestinian Authority. Kindergartens, youth clubs, schools, all kinds of services are being replaced by the Palestinian Authority because they consider Hamas to be a genuine threat for their ambitions. And it seems that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is very near to the point where it can justly claim that they meet all the conditions of George Bush's roadmap. They have one authority, one rule, one weapon. They're almost there. Now, if they are to engage Israel in negotiations on final status, they need to represent the Gaza Strip, something that they cannot do right now. So I think where they're heading is creating or completing the creation of this state infrastructure that they are doing, And then I think on the threat of unilaterally self-declaring independence would come to the president of the US and say, either you do something or we'll declare independence. By the way, I'm sure parts of the world will recognize a self-declared Palestinian state, because President Obama admitted in this, I don't know if you read his Newsweek interview, that he made many mistakes in his approach to the Middle East. But if you look at the achievements of the Nobel Prize winner in the last 2 years in the Middle East, all he gained was getting the two to sit together. At the end of the day, I know it's very popular in Europe to look at President Bush as someone who didn't understand anything in the Middle East. But if you leave aside the Iraqi issue and look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, during President Bush, Israel's right-wing government of Ariel Sharon accepted the roadmap, which wasn't easy for Ariel Sharon, the architect of settlements, dismantled 18 Israeli settlements, pulled out all the Israeli civilians living in the Gaza Strip, unthinkable before. And later, the two leaders, Israeli, Ehud Olmert, and Palestinian Abbas, sat together alone and discussed all the tough issues. That happened in Bush time. But since then, the greatest achievement is that after 18 months of hard effort, the Americans managed to put the Israeli prime minister and Palestinian president together. And not much, and it looks like the Americans are investing their efforts in places where they don't bring too much results now. There's a big effort to declare 2 more months of moratorium on settlements, as if what will happen in 2 months? We reach a final status agreement with the Palestinians. Does it matter if it'll stop for 2 months or 4 months or even 6 months? I do hope that the new foreign policy team, or that partly is being changed now in the US, will bring some fresh approach to the process. But right now, I think Israelis and Palestinians are looking at each other in the West Bank, and what they can aspire to in the foreseeable future is some kind of an interim agreement, and perhaps leaving the issues of final borders to later negotiations, but creating some kind of a provisional state in the West Bank, detached from Gaza. And as for Gaza, I wish I could be hopeful, but in my eyes, Gaza and Israel are going to stay very bad neighbors. I don't see anyone in Gaza capable of challenging Hamas control of the area. Personally, I think we should have completely disengaged from it. We should have stopped providing supplies as well. But we are providing supplies to Gaza, and we took that responsibility. I don't know why, but we're still there. But I cannot say anything hopeful about the Gaza situation. It seems like Gaza will stay a conflict. What we have achieved in the last 2 years is deterrence. I mean, Hamas realized there will be a high price for rocket fire coming out of Gaza. It hadn't stopped, but Hamas is not taking part of it anymore. And when you look at the opposition that Hamas is facing within the Gaza Strip today, personally, I'm happy that we didn't follow the advice of some of the military officers that during Operation Cast Lead, during the fighting in Gaza, were recommending to topple Hamas regime. Because what we see today is that Hamas has new opposition from the right. All kinds of these Al-Qaeda affiliate organizations, some of them Jalalat, and other organizations that are challenging Hamas for being too vegetarian on the Israeli issue. And Hamas has their own ways of treating an opposition. They massacred 30 of them in order to send a message, but still they do have this opposition, and we suspect that if we had removed Hamas's regime in Gaza, those would have filled the void, because clearly Fatah is completely incapable in gaining control of Gaza. So not very hopeful on the Gaza issue, very encouraging developments in the West Bank, but overshadowing it all is the Iranian issue. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you very much.